This is part one of the lecture, Socialism and Counter-Revolution in Chile. And where we are in the class is we're in the post-1945 period where increasingly solutions to the problems of political economy of Latin America are becoming more and more radicalized. Populism had been tried and ultimately failed in Argentina and Brazil. We can question how much it failed in Mexico, but certainly at the end of Cardenas, he did not pick someone who would continue his policies. There was a democratic revolution in Guatemala, which was read by the U.S. as being too radical and so was overthrown. And that led to Castro saying, well, I'm going to have a revolution and I am going to go pretty far to the left and I'm going to make ties to the Soviet Union to prevent myself from being overthrown. And that brings us to the case of Chile. Now, Chile had the deepest, most interesting, most robust democracy. It was limited in the 19th century, but as we saw when we talked about the Popular Front, it was the most democratic country in Latin America. And Chile at various times in the post-World War II period, but particularly beginning in 1970, tried to have a socialist revolution that was democratically done through elections without radical measures, and it sadly was overthrown by the right and the military working closely with the United States. But it's important that we first kind of understand the context. And the first context is, of course, the economy. There were tremendous growth in exports in Chile beginning in the mid-19th century and continuing into the 20th century. But with success in exports, there was internal economic development. There was the growth of industry, there was the rise of a middle class, and this strained the political system. And some of the actors who had been involved in the civil wars in the 19th century, workers, peasants, middle class groups, all were seeking more and more political power. They were seeking some form of representation. And luckily for them, Chile's political system allowed for, by the standards of Latin America, maybe even you could say the standards of the Western Hemisphere, some fairly unique outcomes. The aristocratic republic that was put in place in the mid-19th century slowly opened up to more inclusive politics. If you recall, with the defeat of Balmaceda in 1891, there was tremendous power put in the legislature, not because people thought to be more democratic in the sense of giving everyone a lot of power, but to diffuse the power of the chief executive. But that opened the way for new political actors, just as urbanization is taking place, just as there's early industrialization. The people who are coming into the society via these new routes have a way to be represented politically through the legislature. And the most obvious example of that was in the Popular Front governments of the 1930s into 1947. And that just shows us how important this was. Now, I have a couple of pictures that are worth seeing. This is Chile's old Congress building. It's quite beautiful. It's reminiscent of a building you might see in Washington, D.C. This is its interior. It is, quite ornate. You could, at first blush, you could mistake it for a church. And do you notice that you've got this sort of sharp divide down the aisles, the government and the opposition? So it has a very parliamentary feel, a little bit unlike the U.S. Congressional building. And here's the new modern congressional building, which, you've got the two sides and then that middle level. I mean, it's not my cup of tea architecturally, but it's very interesting. And the reason I put it up there is just that it's so important to understand how much Chileans revere the power of the Congress, that it's really seen as the institution that represents people and the whole population. And this is different from the rest of Latin America. We don't have that in much of Latin America. Well, as we saw in a previous lecture, and as I mentioned earlier in this lecture, the Popular Front governments are incredibly important. But they have a context of, the coming of World War II and the fighting of World War II. But after World War II, we have the Cold War. And so why would you imagine that the United States would, get rid of Arbenz in Guatemala, later be, very unhappy with Castro and try to overthrow him at the Bay of Pigs, but somehow allow a Popular Front government to exist? So it does not. And the Popular Front government comes to an end in 1947. And there are regular elections in Chile after that. But what's really interesting is that the presidential term in Chile is 6 years. And in the 1958 presidential election, everyone, the U.S. government, elites in Chile, they're really surprised how well the left does. And the left is represented by a senator named Salvador Allende. And he runs on a coalition of the Socialist Party, he's a socialist, of Chile, the Communist Party of Chile, and the Radical Party. Now, that's exactly the old Popular Front coalition. And in a kind of split vote, he got close to a third. He got 28.9% of the vote. The conservatives were able to claim power with 31.6% of the vote, and there were other people splitting up, but the conservatives took the presidency. But what worried a lot of people on the right and worried people in the United States government was that there was tremendous population growth and increasing enfranchisement, in other words, getting the right to vote, among the poorest segments of the society. The poorest segments of society had the largest families, and these people were really likely to vote for the communists or the socialists, probably more the socialists. But they were going to vote for Salvador Allende's coalition. And there's another election in 6 years. So they looked at those trends and they said, geez, there's not a lot of difference between the vote. And in 6 years, this man, Allende, could become president. Now, Allende came from one of the oldest families. He can trace his roots back to the colonial period. He was a medical doctor. He got involved in politics during the Popular Front period. He was a senator. He's not a radical. He's not out organizing strikes. He's in the political system, but he represents the left in the political system. Now, he represented the left, and it so worried the United States, particularly in the aftermath of the Cuban Revolution, right? So the Chilean election is 58. Castro comes to power in 59, and 61, 62 is asserting himself as a Marxist-Leninist. So the United States intervened in the 1964 election. Now, when you hear about interventions, you think of Marines landing or, the Bay of Pigs or what happened to Arbenz. This was a much quieter, more sophisticated form of intervention. The United States secretly held negotiations between right-wing politicians and the center-right, which was more or less around a party known as the Christian Democrats, saying if we don't divide the vote three ways, then we can prevent the left. The left got almost 29%. Maybe they'd get 33 or 34%. But if there's a unified right and center right, then we can take the remainder. And not only did the United States broker this deal, and in fact, the conservatives said, yes, we will support the Christian Democrat Eduardo Frei, but the United States government funneled in millions of dollars, quite secretly, to buy off journalists, to fund advertising campaigns. There was tremendous backing for Frei. But it is also important to understand that Frei, although I said he's in the center right, is probably really more just a centrist. He's a nationalist centrist. He is no conservative. He's certainly not a true conservative. So in some ways, you could look at the 1964 vote and say, that Frei won. There he is, wearing the presidential sash. But he did not win saying, I am the antithesis of the liberals or the radicals. He came to power as a conservative. And in fact, he governed as a moderate, and he was very successful and very popular. But during his period of governance, he tremendously raised expectations that things would go even further. He did something called the Chileanization of copper. In other words, he said, I'm not going to nationalize it. The state won't own the copper mines, but we're going to make sure that national Chilean firms own it instead of foreign firms, primarily U.S. firms. He also spoke at length on the need for an agrarian reform, but he never started one. And so while he left the country in very good shape, people were extremely happy with his period of governance, he also led people to believe that things were going to keep going in a reform way. And I think what's important to keep in mind is that the radical solution from Allende is a radical reformist solution. It's not revolutionary in the sense of, the seizure of private property and that sort of thing. So in some perverse ways, even though Frei was put in power with the help of the United States to keep Allende from being elected, Frei really cleared the path for Allende 6 years later in the 1970 election.